He stood in front of the board, grinning, pitching my invention like he wrote every line of code. He thought I was just the quiet engineer in the background. But when he took credit for my 1.UB system, I didn't scream, I simply sold it to his biggest competitor for $1. Here's how he lost everything, over one stolen idea. My name is Samantha Reeve. Until recently, I was the technical director at Stratton Core Systems in Minneapolis, a defense technology company that grew from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise largely on the back of my work. I'm 36 years old, with 15 years of experience in cryptographic authentication systems and behavioral biometrics. I'm the architect behind Aegis Link, a $1.2 billion federal authentication system that helps government agencies verify personnel using advanced behavioral biometrics and multi-layered authentication protocols. I remember the day I joined Stratton. It wasn't even called that back then, just Core Systems, operating out of a renovated warehouse with exposed brick walls and drafty windows that rattled when the Minneapolis winter winds blew. There were 20 of us, including the founders, Martin Stratt and Rebecca Titan, whose combined last names would eventually become our corporate identity. We were idealists, many of us former government contractors who believed we could build more secure systems without the bureaucratic overhead. I was 21, fresh out of MIT with dual degrees in computer science and cognitive science. My thesis on behavioral authentication patterns had caught Martin's attention. "We don't need another coder," he told me during my interview. "We need someone who thinks about security from the human perspective." That approach would eventually become the cornerstone of Aegis Link. The early days were exhilarating. We worked 18-hour days, coding on whiteboards, debating security protocols over 2 a.m. pizza, sleeping on office couches when deadlines loomed. I built the core authentication framework from scratch, combining traditional biometrics with what I called behavioral fingerprinting, the unique patterns in how individuals interact with systems, from keyboard rhythms to mouse movements to eye tracking. My first patent application was filed 8 months in. By year 3, I had 11 patents to my name, all assigned to the company as per my employment agreement, but with my name clearly listed as the inventor. When we secured our first government contract, a modest $2.3 million deal with the Department of Energy, my name appeared on the technical specifications as the responsible design authority. For 7 years, we grew organically. 30 employees became 100, then 300. We moved from the warehouse to a proper office building, then to a small campus. Every government contract built on the last, each one expanding the scope of what would eventually become Aegis Link. I hired and trained dozens of engineers, building a team that understood my vision and could execute against it. Rebecca left after year 5, pursuing a different venture. Martin remained CEO, and I became technical director, reporting directly to him. We had a good relationship. He handled the business, I handled the technology, and we consulted each other on major decisions. We weren't friends outside work, but we respected each other's domains. The turning point came in our 8th year. We'd just completed a successful pilot for what would become Aegis Link, demonstrating seamless authentication across 3 federal agencies. The pilot drew attention, including from several venture capital firms and private equity groups. After months of negotiations, Martin accepted a significant investment from Arcturus Capital, a private equity firm specializing in government contractors. The money came with conditions. Arcturus wanted professional management, which meant replacing Martin as CEO. He fought it initially, but eventually agreed, retaining the title of founder and chairman while yielding operational control. His replacement was Clayton Voss, a polished executive who'd previously led the turnaround of a mid-sized defense contractor. Clayton arrived with a mandate to grow aggressively. Our headcount doubled within a year. New executives appeared, most with impressive resumes but little understanding of our technology or culture. Among them was Michael Barron, recruited from a fintech company to serve as our new chief technology officer. I remember my first meeting with Michael clearly. It was in the new executive boardroom, all glass and chrome, nothing like the comfortable clutter of our old offices. He wore an expensive suit, had perfectly coiffed hair, and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "I've reviewed your authentication framework," he said, flipping through a printed copy of my technical specification. "Interesting approach. Reminds me of what we implemented at FinSecure, though we found behavioral metrics unreliable in high-stress environments." I explained that our system actually performed better under stress, as pressure amplified individual behavioral patterns. I could see his eyes glaze over as I detailed the neural network architecture that made this possible. "Well," he said when I finished, "I'm sure we can optimize this further. I'd like to bring in some of my people from FinSecure to review the entire codebase." That became the pattern. Michael would question design decisions, suggest unnecessary changes, and gradually insert himself between me and the executive team. In meetings with Clayton, Michael would present my work as if we'd collaborated on it, or worse, as if he'd provided the guiding vision while I merely implemented details. I tried to adapt. I documented everything meticulously. I ensured my team knew who had designed what. I became more assertive in meetings, correcting Michael when he misrepresented our work. This only seemed to irritate him, and increasingly, I found myself excluded from high-level discussions. The real trouble began when we entered the final bidding for what would become the full Aegis Link contract, a comprehensive authentication system for federal agencies, valued at $1.2 billion over 10 years. Our main competitor was Nexora Defense, a larger and more established contractor. The technical specifications for the bid were essentially written around our existing work, giving us a significant advantage. As the bid process intensified, Michael took increasing control of customer presentations. At first, he would have me attend meetings with him, but gradually, I found myself relegated to preparation sessions, not invited to the actual client meetings. When I questioned this, he assured me it was just streamlining the process. "Too many cooks in the kitchen confuse the client," he explained. "They want a single point of contact." I might have accepted this if he'd accurately represented our work. Instead, I began hearing troubling reports from colleagues who attended these meetings. Michael was describing architectural decisions as his own. He was taking credit for resolving technical challenges that my team had solved years before he arrived. Most disturbingly, he was promising capabilities beyond what our system could deliver, setting us up for implementation failures. I brought my concerns to Clayton, who listened politely but took no action. "Michael's doing a fantastic job positioning us to win this contract," he said. "The technical details will sort themselves out during implementation." I thought about going to Martin, but he had become increasingly distant from day-to-day operations, focused on his role as chairman and on various personal ventures. The company had changed around me, from a close-knit team to a corporate hierarchy where relationships mattered more than technical truth. Then came the Security Innovation Conference in Washington, DST, the premier event in our industry, attended by every major government client and contractor. Michael was scheduled to deliver a keynote presentation on next-generation authentication, the Aegis Link approach. I wasn't invited to attend, but a former colleague who now worked for the Department of Homeland Security sent me the slide deck afterward. What I saw made my blood boil. Not only had Michael presented Aegis Link as his brainchild, but the presentation included code snippets and architectural diagrams lifted directly from my documentation with my name removed. The acknowledgement slide thanked everyone from Clayton to the marketing team, with no mention of me or my original team. I printed the presentation and walked straight to Clayton's office. His assistant tried to stop me, saying he was in a meeting, but I pushed past her and placed the printout on his desk. "This is plagiarism," I said, my voice steady despite my rage. Michael presented my work as his own at the most important conference in our industry. Clayton glanced at the slides, then looked up at me with a practiced expression of concern. "Samantha, I understand you're upset, but this is a company presentation. All of our work is Stratton intellectual property. That doesn't mean erasing the creators," I countered. "My name is on 11 patents that make Aegis Link possible. I'm the technical authority named in our government contracts." "Which we're very grateful for," Clayton said smoothly. "But as we grow, we need to present a unified front. Personal credit becomes less important than corporate branding." This isn't about credit, I said, though of course it partly was. It's about honesty. Michael is making technical claims and commitments he doesn't understand. When implementation problems arise, who will solve them? The actual engineers who built the system, not the person taking credit. Clayton's expression hardened. I think you're overreacting. Michael has brought valuable perspective to the project, and his presentation skills are exactly what we need at this stage. I left the meeting knowing something fundamental had changed. The company I'd helped build no longer valued the truth, at least not when it conflicted with the narrative preferred by its new leadership. I spent the next week debating my options. I could escalate to the board. But Arcturus controlled the majority of seats, and they had installed Clayton and approved Michael's hiring. I could resign in protest, but that would only remove the last barrier to Michael's complete takeover of my work. I could quietly seek employment elsewhere, but my heart was in Aegis Link. I had devoted a decade of my life to it. Before I could decide on a course of action, the decision was made for me. It was a Thursday afternoon when I received a calendar invitation from Diane Foster, our HR director, for a meeting the following morning. Also invited were Clayton, Michael, and James Winters from our legal department. The subject line read simply, "Personnel Discussion." I knew immediately what was happening. They were pushing me out. The only question was whether it would be framed as a layoff, a reassignment, or some form of performance issue. I spent the night gathering personal items from my office, backing up personal emails, and photographing the whiteboards in our development area where the evolution of key algorithms was documented in my handwriting. The meeting itself was brief and clinical. Clayton spoke first, explaining that as the company evolved, roles needed to be realigned for optimal organizational efficiency. My position as technical director would be eliminated, with my team distributed under various managers reporting to Michael. I was being offered a new role as a senior technical advisor, a title with no direct reports, no budget authority, and ambiguous responsibilities. It was the corporate equivalent of being sent to a remote outpost, a role designed to encourage resignation without the legal complications of termination. "We value your contributions, Samantha," Clayton said, not quite meeting my eyes. "This role will allow you to focus on innovation without administrative burdens." Michael nodded enthusiastically. "I've been hoping to free you up from management responsibilities so you can get back to what you do best, solving difficult technical problems." I remained silent, watching the performance. Diane slid a document across the table, the formal restructuring notice, along with a reminder of my confidentiality obligations. James cleared his throat and added the legal perspective. "Just to be clear," he said, "all intellectual property developed during your employment belongs exclusively to Stratton, per your employment agreement. That includes all aspects of Aegis Link, regardless of your role going forward." I signed the document without argument. Then I asked the question they were clearly expecting. What about my access to the Aegis Link development environment? Clayton and Michael exchanged glances. "For security purposes," Clayton said, "your access will be modified to reflect your new advisory role. You'll have read-only access to the documentation, but system modifications will need to go through the standard approval process now." In other words, I was being locked out of my own creation. I nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable, gathered my copy of the signed documents, and left the meeting. By the time I returned to my office, my security badge already showed restricted access, and my login credentials for the development environment had been modified. What they didn't understand, what they never bothered to learn, was that Aegis Link wasn't just a technical product. It was a government contract with specific legal requirements. And one of those requirements, which I had insisted on years earlier, was that all system modifications had to be verified by the original technical authority. My name was written into the contract itself as the required signatory for system changes. They could reassign me, restrict my access, even eventually fire me, but they couldn't remove that contractual obligation without renegotiating the entire agreement. It was my insurance policy, though I had never imagined I would need to use it. I spent the weekend processing what had happened. I felt betrayed, certainly, but also curiously liberated. For years, I had subordinated my own recognition to the good of the company. I had accepted corporate ownership of my inventions as part of the standard employment relationship. But now that relationship had been violated, not legally, perhaps, but certainly in spirit. I was no longer bound by loyalty to an organization that had discarded me. And while I respected the legal constraints of my employment agreement, I knew there were actions I could take that stayed within those boundaries while serving my own interests. I possessed no proprietary data. I was too ethical to steal client information or specific implementation details. But I did have something more valuable, a comprehensive understanding of the Aegis Link architecture, its strengths and weaknesses, and most importantly, its evolutionary path. I knew what problems would emerge as the system scaled, what improvements would be needed, and how the next generation should be designed. On Monday morning, I submitted my resignation, effective immediately. I cited irreconcilable differences regarding technical direction and declined the senior advisor position. HR processed my departure with suspicious efficiency. I was escorted from the building within an hour. My personal belongings shipped to my home the following day. That afternoon, I registered Reeve Secure Works LLC and began drafting the architectural specifications for what I called Aegis Nova, not a copy of Aegis Link, but its logical successor, built from first principles with a completely different technical approach. Where Aegis Link used a centralized authentication authority, Aegis Nova would use a distributed trust model. Where Aegis Link relied on proprietary algorithms, Aegis Nova would use open-source components in a unique configuration. Most crucially, Aegis Nova would address the fundamental weakness of Aegis Link, its dependence on a single vendor. Government agencies using Aegis Link were locked into Strateton for updates, support, and modifications. Aegis Nova would be vendor agnostic, with its core protocols published as open standards that any qualified contractor could implement. I worked feverishly for 2 weeks, sleeping little, sustaining myself on coffee and takeout. By the end of that period, I had a complete technical specification, implementation roadmap, and financial projections. What I didn't have was the capital or connections to bring it to market. That's when I reached out to Nexora Defense. Nexora had been Strateton's main competitor for the Aegis Link contract. They had superior resources and government relationships, but lacked the innovative authentication approach that had given us the edge. Their loss of the contract had been a significant setback, one that industry analysts estimated had cost them billions in potential revenue. I sent a brief email to Diana Wong, Nexora's chief strategy officer, whom I had met at various industry events. I described my situation in professional terms, without emotion or accusations, and proposed a meeting to discuss mutual opportunities in the federal authentication space. Diana responded within hours, and we arranged to meet at a hotel bar in Chicago, neutral territory, away from both Minneapolis and Nexora's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. The meeting was cordial but cautious. Diana was accompanied by Nexora's CTO, a former NSA cryptographer named Robert Chen, and their lead counsel, Sarah Martinez. I brought no one. Reeve Secure Works consisted of exactly one person. I laid out my proposal. I would provide Nexora with the complete specifications for Aegis Nova, including implementation guidance, transition planning for agencies currently using Aegis Link, and my personal consulting services. In exchange, I wanted 3 things: a 1-year consulting contract at a specified rate, a role as the public face of the project with full credit for its architecture, and an unusual pricing structure. I want you to sell Aegis Nova to the federal government for $1, I said, watching their reactions carefully. Sarah laughed, then realized I was serious. You can't be serious. The development costs alone would be hundreds of millions, which Nexora can easily absorb, given your annual R&D budget. I countered, what you're buying isn't just a system, it's market position. You're establishing Nexora as the company that delivered a superior solution at a fraction of the cost of Aegis Link. You're creating a narrative about putting national security above profit, and you're opening the door to service contracts, implementation support, and training that will generate billions over the system's lifetime. Robert was already nodding. The distributed trust model solves the single vendor problem that's plagued these contracts for years. Agencies have been asking for this approach, but couldn't get it past procurement. Diana was more skeptical. This sounds like a revenge play against your former employer. How do we know you're not violating trade secrets or contractual obligations? I pushed a folder across the table. This is an analysis by Morgenstern and Pike, comparing the Aegis Link architecture to Aegis Nova. As you'll see, they share no code, no algorithms, and no implementation details. They solve the same problem through fundamentally different approaches. Everything in Aegis Nova is derived from publicly available research and my own expertise, not from Stratton's proprietary technology. The legal opinion had cost me $15,000, nearly all of my liquid savings, but it was worth every penny. Sarah reviewed it carefully, occasionally nodding. "It's clean," she finally said. "Different enough to avoid infringement claims, similar enough in capability to be competitive." Diana drummed her fingers on the table. The $1 price point is a gimmick. It would make headlines, certainly, but procurement regulations require competitive pricing. The base system is $1. I clarified. Implementation services, training, certification. Those are priced normally. But the core intellectual property, the thing that makes this valuable, that's $1. Because this isn't about money for me. "What is it about, then?" Diana asked. I considered my answer carefully. Recognition, not fame or credit, exactly, but acknowledgement of creation. When you build something from nothing, pour your mind and years of your life into it, watch it grow from concept to reality, it becomes part of you. Having that creation taken and claimed by someone else is... I paused, searching for the right word. It's theft of self. The three Nexora executives exchanged glances. Robert spoke first. "I want to move forward with this. The technical approach is sound better than sound. It's elegant. And the distributed trust model solves problems we've been struggling with for years." Diana was still hesitant. "The $1 price point will create chaos in the market. It will disrupt every authentication contract currently in negotiation." "Exactly," I said. "It resets the entire landscape, with Nexora at the center." The meeting ended without a firm commitment, but I could tell they were intrigued. A week later, Diana called to schedule a follow-up meeting, this time at Nexora headquarters with their full executive team. That meeting lasted 8 hours, diving deep into technical details, market implications, and legal considerations. By the end, we had the outline of an agreement Nexora would develop and market Aegis Nova based on my specifications, with me serving as the public-facing chief architect through a consulting arrangement. The base system would indeed be offered to the federal government for $1, with normal pricing for implementation and support services. While Nexora's team began the development process, an interesting situation was developing at Stratton. Aegis Link had been deployed to its first 3 federal agencies, with several more in the implementation pipeline. But without my oversight, problems were emerging. The system was rejecting valid authentication attempts, flagging routine access patterns as potential security threats, and generating thousands of false positives daily. These issues stemmed from subtle calibration parameters that I had always adjusted manually during implementation adjustments that were documented nowhere except in my own notes and experience. Michael's team, lacking this institutional knowledge, was struggling to identify the source of the problems. I knew about these issues because former colleagues still reached out to me, seeking unofficial guidance. I politely declined to help, citing my separation agreement, but kept track of the escalating situation. 10 days after my departure, I received a text message from Clayton. "Need to discuss Aegis Link issues. Can you consult Will, make it worth your while?" I didn't respond. 3 days later, an email from Michael. "Experiencing some calibration challenges with the behavioral authentication module. Would appreciate your insights. Standard consulting rate." I didn't respond to that either. A week later, a formal letter from Stratton's legal department offering a consulting agreement at $5,000 per hour for technical advisory services related to Aegis Link implementation. I sent a brief reply, unable to assist due to current professional commitments. The next day, the offer increased to $15,000 per hour. With a minimum engagement of 40 hours, I didn't respond. By this point, according to my former colleagues, the situation at Stratton was becoming desperate. 2 federal agencies had temporarily suspended use of Aegis Link, reverting to their previous authentication systems while the issues were resolved. The Department of Defense, which was next in the implementation queue, had paused its transition plan pending resolution of the reported problems. Clayton attempted to reach me by phone several times. I let the calls go to voicemail. His messages grew increasingly urgent, eventually hinting at potential legal action if I was deliberately withholding critical information. This was an empty threat. I had no contractual obligation to help them, and withholding my own expertise was not a legal offense. Meanwhile, Nexora's development of Aegis Nova was proceeding rapidly. With a team of over 100 engineers and my full-time guidance, they had a working prototype within 6 weeks. The distributed trust model was functioning exactly as designed, and preliminary security audits showed superior performance compared to centralized systems like Aegis Link. Diana arranged a private demonstration for selected officials from various federal agencies. Without explicitly positioning it as a competitor to Aegis Link, we showcased how Aegis Nova addressed the precise issues those agencies were experiencing with Stratton's system. The reaction was immediate and positive. Within days, we were receiving inquiries about procurement timelines and implementation requirements. Diana, a master of government relations, began laying the groundwork for what would become known in the industry as the pivot, a rapid shift from one authentication standard to another. 3 months after my departure from Stratton, with Aegis Link implementations stalled across multiple agencies and Nexora's prototype demonstrating clear superiority, Diana made her move. At the annual Federal Cybersecurity Summit in Washington, DVMAC, she announced Aegis Nova to the world. The presentation was masterful. Diana outlined the limitations of centralized authentication systems without ever naming Aegis Link specifically. She introduced the distributed trust model as the future of federal security. Then, in the moment that would make headlines across the industry, she announced the pricing. The core Aegis Nova system will be provided to federal agencies for $1, not $1 per user, not $1 per authentication, $1 total. The room erupted in confusion and excitement. Government procurement officials were accustomed to paying billions for such systems. Competing vendors looked stunned. Then Diana introduced me as the chief architect of Aegis Nova. I walked onto the stage to applause, made brief remarks about the technical advantages of the distributed approach, and then delivered the line we had carefully crafted. Security isn't about proprietary control, it's about transparent trust. Aegis Nova doesn't belong to any single vendor. It belongs to the agencies that protect our nation, and to the citizens they serve. The industry reaction was immediate. Technology publications ran features with titles like Authentication Revolution and The Dollar That Changed Federal Security. Government technology officers began publicly questioning their Aegis Link implementations. Stratton's stock price dropped 12% the day of the announcement. By the end of the week, as analysts digested the implications, it had fallen another 23%. Clayton attempted to counter with a hastily arranged press conference, promising accelerated updates to Aegis Link and dismissing Aegis Nova as untested technology from an unproven architect. This only drew attention to the problems they were experiencing and raised questions about why the original architect of Aegis Link was now working with their competitor. The decisive moment came 2 weeks later. The Department of Homeland Security, facing continuing issues with their Aegis Link implementation and impressed by the Aegis Nova demonstrations, announced they were suspending their Aegis Link contract pending a security review. 3 other agencies followed suit within days. Stratton's stock went into freefall, losing 65% of its value in a single week. Arcturus Capital, seeing their investment collapsing, demanded changes. Clayton was removed as CEO, replaced temporarily by a turnaround specialist from Arcturus. Michael was simply terminated. his executive position eliminated in a streamlining of technical leadership. A month later, after reviewing the mounting implementation failures and the contractual requirement for my signature on system modifications, the General Services Administration formally terminated the government-wide Aegis Link contract. The official reason was material failure to deliver contracted capabilities. But the industry understood the real cause: Stratton had lost the person who made their system work. The same week, the GSA announced a sole source award to Nexora for implementation of Aegis Nova across federal agencies, with a base price of $1 and implementation services valued at $2.6 billion over 10 years. Straton filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection the following month. Their assets, including the Aegis Link intellectual property, were eventually sold to a smaller competitor for pennies on the dollar. The company that had been valued at over $3 billion at its peak was effectively gone. Meanwhile, I found myself in an unexpected position, a technical founder with public recognition and substantial influence. Wired magazine put me on their cover, under the headline, "She Rebuilt Trust in National Security for $1." I was invited to testify before congressional committees on cybersecurity, keynote major industry conferences, and consult with government agencies on their security architectures. My consulting contract with Nexora evolved into a formal position as Chief Security Architect, with equity compensation that would eventually make me wealthy. But more satisfying than the money was the recognition seeing my name on the architectural specifications, hearing officials and engineers discuss the REEV framework when describing authentication protocols. There's an epilogue to this story that few people know. 6 months after Stratton's collapse, I received an email from Martin Stratt, the original founder who had hired me 15 years earlier. "I should have paid more attention," he wrote. "When Clayton and Michael started changing things, I told myself it was just the natural evolution of the company. I didn't realize they were dismantling everything we built. I'm sorry, Samantha. You deserved better." I met Martin for coffee the following week. He looked older, tired, the failure of his company etched in the new lines on his face. We talked for hours about the early days, the warehouse office, the excitement of building something new. "I've been thinking about starting over," he said eventually. "Something smaller, focused on research, not chasing government contracts. Real innovation, like we used to do." "What's stopping you?" I asked. He smiled ruefully. "Besides capital, I need a technical co-founder, someone who understands security from the human perspective." I considered this for a moment. "I'm pretty busy these days," I said, "but I might know some talented engineers looking for a new challenge." Over the next few months, I introduced Martin to several former Stratton engineers who had been displaced by the bankruptcy. With modest funding from angel investors, including a significant amount from me, anonymously he launched a new company focused on privacy-preserving authentication for humanitarian organizations. I serve on their technical advisory board, reviewing architectural decisions and occasionally contributing code during weekend hackathons. We're not seeking billion-dollar contracts or flashy headlines. We're just building good technology that solves real problems. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing code or drafting specifications, I think about Michael standing in front of the board, presenting my work as his own. I think about how easily the truth can be obscured in corporate environments, how creation can be separated from creator through legal agreements and organizational hierarchies. I don't regret what I did. Aegis Link would have failed eventually, with or without my intervention. Systems built on misappropriated credit and misrepresented expertise always do. What I regret is not standing up sooner, not insisting on recognition from the beginning. That's the lesson I share with the young engineers I now mentor. Your name matters. Your creation is an extension of yourself. No employment agreement, no corporate hierarchy, no smooth-talking executive can change that fundamental truth. The code you write, the systems you design, the problems you solve, these are your legacy. Protect them. Insist on recognition. And if that recognition is denied, remember that sometimes the most powerful response isn't outrage or litigation. Sometimes it's simply building something better. and selling it for $1.